Just kidding. I didn't get the signal.
Yeah, just give it 1 second.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Julia Smith with the Association of American Universities. We are a proud member of ESEP. For those of you joining us for the first time, the ESEP Coalition is the Engaging Scientists and Engineers in Policy Coalition. We're an ad hoc alliance of organizations that have joined together to empower scientists and engineers to effectively engage in the policymaking process at all levels of government. ESEP serves as a resource one-stop shop, communication forum, networking opportunity, and as an engagement vehicle for science and tech policy stakeholders. Today, we are welcoming you to our webinar on the topic of working with your state legislatures. If you would like to submit a question during the webinar, you can do so on the dashboard under the Questions tab. Melanie will take all the questions, and she'll be answering those towards the end of the webinar today. I am pleased to introduce our host, Melanie. Melanie Roberts is a science and technology policy consultant based in Seattle, Washington, and a member of the ESEP Steering Committee. She previously founded a service leadership program at AAAS that recruited teams of graduate students to work on issues at a local level, and she is currently working on several projects to build science and technology policy capacity at a state and local level. I'm going to turn it over to you, Melanie.
Thanks so much, Julia, and I am thrilled to be joined by two other scientists who have gone into policy, Senator Chris Rothfuss from Wyoming and Deborah Cooper. Hello, Chris. Thanks for joining us. And Deborah Cooper, who's a principal consultant for the California State Senate. Hi, Deborah. Thanks for joining.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Hi. So, absolutely. We appreciate it. So this will be an informal conversation. Before we get started, I just have a few announcements to make on behalf of ESEP. One is, as some of you know, we do online discussions through AAAS's collaboration hub, which is called Trellis. And this webinar is actually the first in a series of events and conversations that we're going to be having on state and local policy engagement. In December, we're going to be highlighting Artie Garg, who's the founder and chair of another organization called Engineers and Scientists Acting Locally. I'm also on the steering committee of ESAL as well, and our mission is to help engineers and scientists become more civically engaged, both in policy and nonprofit issues at city, state, and regional level. And actually, I'll type in the, you should be able to see in the chat box on the right, I'll just type their web address in, esal.us. They have some, it's a pretty new organization, but we have some resources. We do a blog series of scientists who are participating in policy and nonprofits. And Artie will be available on Trellis to answer your questions about working at a state and local level. And to join Trellis, it is www.trellis, Trellis, science.com/ESEP. That should have just shown up in your chat box. And anybody can join that discussion. So, with my announcements covered, I would like to invite my two colleagues into conversation about how you got involved in state policy and share some tips for others of you who are attending about how they might get started. So I just wanted to start first by hearing about your personal story of how why and how you switched from science into policy, and especially into state policy. And Deborah, I'd invite you to go first. Thank you.
All right. Well, I'd say my journey started when I was in grad school. At that time, I was coming to the conclusion that I didn't see myself in a fully academic career or going down that path. And I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. I realized through doing, since I was in grad school for neuroscience, I did Brain Week. Every year we had Brain Awareness Week, and we'd go out to schools, talk to the students about, different things about the brain. My research in particular was about drug addiction, so I would talk about myths about drugs and drug use and everything. And went to a few community events and everything. And from that, I realized that I really, really enjoyed talking to non-scientists about science. And, I ended up, after grad school, I did do a postdoc for a period of time. And in that postdoc, I did a lot more of these community engagement, and it was very evident that I wanted to do something outside of academia in that role where I could talk about science. I was looking into either science communication or science policy, and as I was looking about how different avenues, how I could get into those roles, I came across the California Council of Science and Technology, or what I'll say from here on out is CCST, an organization out here in California that has a fellowship that places PhD level scientists in the California State Legislature. And so about a year into my fellowship, into my postdoc, I applied for that fellowship, got in, and I started that fellowship at the end of 2013, end of 2014 going into 2015, and have been with the California legislature since there. So the fellowship, the CCST fellowship, is a one-year fellowship. It places 10 PhD level scientists into the California legislature, sort of like in Congress, how you have the House and the Senate. In California, we have the Senate and the Assembly instead of the House. So we have 5 fellows that are placed with the Senate and 5 fellows that are placed with the Assembly. I was placed with the Senate in a position in an office called the Senate Office of Research. I worked there for about a year and a half, and then transitioned into my current role, still within the Senate. Now I'm in the Senate Committee on Appropriations. So it's a committee that analyzes when bills come through the legislature, we look at if this bill were to actually become a law, how much would it cost the state to implement the bill? And so that's the day in and day out, that's the analysis that I do on the bills that come through our office. So that's my path to where I am and where I am now.
Thank you for sharing. I also was a neuroscientist, and Chris and I actually did a fellowship as well. Ours was the AAAS fellowship in DC. So Chris, I'd be interested to hear what drew you into policy and why you chose state policy and actually decided to run for office. Absolutely.
So I've been interested in policy all my life, and when I was young, I was interested in who was running for what and how politics were affecting us and influencing, shaping society. I didn't have any real family connections or any strong ties, but it was a constant topic of conversation. When I was in high school, when I was in college, I ended up on the debate team. And the debate is kind of all about politics, all about political issues. So I did intercollegiate debate while I was at the University of Wyoming for the 4 years. And I actually started off as an undergraduate at the University of Wyoming in engineering, but decided that I didn't think I could simultaneously do engineering and debate and do either of them well. So I switched from engineering to international studies with specialization in political science. So my undergraduate degree at the university, I had a strong science background, but it actually was a policy degree in international studies and very much oriented towards intercollegiate debate for those 4 years. But I missed science. I still was heavily interested in science for those years, so I stayed around and got a master's degree in chemical engineering, which was a hard few years since I needed a lot of the undergraduate courses to make that time up. And then went to the University of Washington for a Ph.D. in chemical engineering and a master's in applied physics, working largely on nanoscale research in an electrochemistry lab there. But again, now I'd been doing all science for several years, and I was missing policy. And like many people when they're finishing up their PhD, you kind of want to do anything but what you just did your PhD on for a couple of years. So at about that time, I received an email from AAAS about the Science and Technology Policy Fellowship Program, and thought that seemed like a great thing to do next, to bring together my interest in policy and my interest in science and my experience in science. So I applied for the fellowship through AAAS and was fortunate to receive a fellowship with the U.S. Department of State, the Diplomacy Fellowship. So in 2003, I went to Washington, D.C. and joined the State Department. I ended up for a short time in the Science and Technology Advisor to the Secretary's Office, worked on some policy related to the reconstruction in Iraq, to some other broader programs on intelligence community policy. But then I shifted over to Space and Advanced Technologies in the OES Bureau at the State Department. And just had a wonderful fellowship experience. I became the U.S. lead on nanotechnology foreign policy. I sort of developed that portfolio for a couple of years and handed that off to fellows that came after me, and spent a lot of time working on space policy, remote sensing policy, orbital debris, that's space junk, nuclear power sources in space. It was an incredible experience, as I think anybody who's went through the program could tell you, and then ended up staying around and hiring on into a foreign affairs officer position for an additional year. So I stayed for 3 years at the department. But about that time, when my wife and I had little kids, you know, at a newborn and a 2-year-old, and we decided we wanted to go back to the state of Wyoming to raise our families here. And so we moved back, started working at the University of Wyoming, started doing some consulting work when we got back, but obviously staying interested in politics, having just finished up the time at the State Department. Well, we moved back in late 2006, so rolling into 2007. That was kind of an interesting year in national politics. That was the first campaign with Hillary Clinton versus later to be President Obama. There was a lot of enthusiasm in national politics, and that trickled down even to the state of Wyoming. There was an incredible enthusiasm. We didn't end up supporting either of those candidates in the election, but it was a time of dynamic politics in the state of Wyoming, and we had an interesting circumstance that developed where one of our U.S. senators passed away, Senator Craig Thomas, and he had an appointment to fill that position, but that appointment was up. So there were 2 Senate seats, 2 U.S. Senate seats that were open in the state of Wyoming for election. One individual, there were candidates that were running for this open seat, late Craig Thomas's seat, but nobody was running against Senator Mike Enzi. It was going to basically be a general election that was uncontested for a seat that was a very important seat. And I had the available time and the interest and the recent experience in Washington, D.C. to run for that United States Senate seat. So for that year, I became the Democratic candidate for the United States Senate for the state of Wyoming, honestly knowing full well that I was going to lose that election by a wide margin. I was about 1 point off in my prediction of what the outcome would be.
But it was good practice, I'm sure.
It was great. It was an incredible experience, and running for United States Senate when you know you're going to lose, it takes a little bit of the pressure off and allows you to learn a lot from it, to meet people, to try and advance issues and policies that you feel are important. One of the things that I really focused on was the lack of science and technology experts in policy. So I focused heavily on that message, which isn't a partisan message. It's just that, hey, we should have more scientific voices engaging in the decision-making process. So it was an incredible year. Sure enough, I lost at the end of it. But along the way, there were a lot of policymakers at the state level, even at the federal level, around the state of Wyoming that said, you know, make sure you stay engaged in this. In fact, we'd like to see you run for the state legislature in 2 years. Oh. So based on that, I came back in 2010, and it just so happened that the Senate district that I live in, the incumbent senator chose to run for a statewide race, so it became an open seat. So I talked to him. I talked to a lot of the local policy makers. I talked to a lot of the party folks in my county and around the state, and ended up deciding to run for that state seat, and was successful in 2010 in that election, and have held that seat then for the last 8 years. For the last 6 years, I've been the Senate Minority Leader for the Wyoming Legislature. And as to why state politics, you can have a very direct and dramatic effect on the lives of your friends, of your family, of the people around you. We always look to the national level based on this assumption that that's where it's at. Those are the decisions that make the most difference. But you know, I serve on the education committees for the state of Wyoming. I serve on our Minerals Business and Economic Development Committee. I've been serving on them for almost a decade now. And that's where the decisions are made that really affect the day-to-day lives of people. I'm setting education policy, and my kids then come back and they live that education policy directly. So when you think about making a difference, a tangible difference that you can see the effects of on a daily basis, state-level policy and even local policy really is where you make those definitive decisions and have, you know, you make a policy change one year, you see it the next. It's hard to do that at the federal level, but you certainly can at the state and local level.
Really good point.
I would echo that sentiment. Yeah, I would echo that sentiment with state and local. The policies that I analyze, the bills that come through, I see directly the effect of those in, you know, day-to-day life. The ones that I directly work on in state policy, and also the ones that I vote on in city and county, I see those affecting me more so than I see the direct daily, day-to-day effect of federal policy.
Yeah, Deborah, and I don't know about the California Senate, but I know that the Wyoming legislature still works. It still works correctly. We pass laws. They're debated, they're amended, we receive public input. It's a process that it's very similar to the one we read about and the one that we heard about with that little cartoon character talking on the screen about how a bill becomes a law. Yeah. It's more or less how we do it, and I think that's kind of heartening that still is in play. It might be a little bit problematic at the national level, but in the states, it still does happen that way.
Right. I'm in Washington State, but as I was mentioning to both of you, it was not easy for me to find, it's really not easy to find many PhDs working in state and local politics. There are more at the federal level, as we know. But so I'm curious to hear how you think your STEM background allows you to do things or helps you to look at issues differently than your colleagues who might have been trained in law or political science or public policy. Deborah.
I think for one thing, there is a level of, we think about things a little bit more analytically. I think when I'm analyzing a bill, when bills come to me and I'm reading through the bill or I'm reading through other analyses, or even if, you know, a lobbyist is talking to me and they're throwing numbers at me and throwing stats, something's going off in my brain that's saying, wait, how did you get that number? What does it mean? How was that surveyed? All of these other things, just actually breaking down everything and really, really digging deep into what do these numbers mean? What is that impact going to look like? I think having to do that in a lab setting, it translates into that's the same information that people are giving to me, and just being able to see that information and understand what it means. And I think, so the analytical mind, I think another big thing is being able to problem solve. When you're working in the lab, things go wrong all the time. You think your experiment's going to go one way, and then something happens, and you have to rally and figure out how are you going to fix it and work on it and make it go a different direction, or just change your hypothesis, whatever it is. You have to do constant problem solving. It's the very same thing in the legislature. Your bill comes up. Your bill is moving along smoothly, and all of a sudden there's opposition, and you have to figure out, how do I work with this opposition to keep it going through? There's just a lot of, everyone knows that there's something, the bill needs to be fixed in some sort of way, but how do you fix it? Thinking through what are the ways that we can make this bill, amend it in such a way that it benefits all the people that is trying to benefit. So that problem solving, thinking about what do I do next to fix it and make it better, that translates as well.
And Chris, what do you think? How do you feel like your STEM background makes you a little bit different from your colleagues?
Well, I think I agree with everything Deborah said, and one other area that I think you gain from a strong science background is just an acceptance of complexity and of large, complicated systems, and an ability to unravel those systems, look at the pieces, try to understand the entire picture instead of just responding, being reactive. So it's incredibly helpful as a policymaker, really, to have a solution-oriented training, which that's one of the things Deborah got at. Same thing for engineering, obviously. You're trying to do something. You're trying to solve something. It's not just about talking. When you're a scientist or an engineer, that won't get you very far. You actually have to stand up and do something and prove something. The proof element and the data-driven analysis element is something else which is sorely lacking in politics at every level, and I try to bring that to Wyoming policy, to our committee meetings, to the Senate floor, trying to bring in data and to challenge data that's misinterpreted, that's low quality, that's been since updated. I think I've probably done more Google Scholar searches from the Senate floor than
yeah, wait a second, how do you know that?
It really does help in terms of crafting policy, though, when you're looking at data and when you can challenge and say, look, there's no evidence that indicates that this policy proposal is going to provide a positive outcome. We haven't seen that. As a matter of fact, we've seen the contrary. Or the results are inconclusive. Or really even just getting into logical analysis where just because a policy didn't conclude one way, or excuse me, a study didn't conclude one way, doesn't necessarily mean the counter was concluded. There are a lot of nuances that a scientific training and a scientific background allow you to bring to the discussion to help to clarify really what is a fact, what can be expected to be evidentiary based, or what is an unproven assertion.
As we have more and more information spread by more and more sources, it seems like that's going to become even more critical that we build Absolutely. That capacity. Yeah. And
I also serve on the Minerals Committee. It's Minerals, Business, and Economic Development, and my background is chemical engineering. Even though my Ph.D. research was very much nanoscale electrochemistry, I have a background that includes a lot of oil and gas experience and energy-related engineering experience, and Wyoming is an energy state. So when we are looking at policy that relates to energy development, to resource development, that's another area where I just bring expertise and experience to the table, and I'm not the nature of the Wyoming legislature as a citizens legislature relies on that type of experience, and it's not just my experience. I have expertise in energy. We have folks that are expert in veterinary sciences. We have folks that are expert in ranching and agriculture, and bringing all of that expertise together with a civilian legislature really does help to shape the discourse, and it helps the legislature itself have sufficient expertise to know what good decisions and bad decisions look like because of practical real-world experience. And that goes beyond just having the scientific experience, but really, what is your day job, and the fact that everyone in the legislature is kind of bringing that day job experience to the legislature makes a difference as well.
Oh, that's an interesting point too, and maybe transitions a little bit into another question that I had. How can I, as an outside expert and a constituent, help you all who are working inside the legislature to promote evidence-informed decision-making? And I'm curious to hear how you interact with outside experts now to help you do your work, and maybe even hear a story of somebody who was particularly helpful and why you think they were, or maybe particularly unhelpful, if you wanted to share that story of what not to do. Deborah, can you start?
Well, I would say just as an outside expert, that being involved is always, we need advocates, we need, people. It's, I know a lot of professional societies, at least in DC, or when they go to DC, do Hill Days. And you go to Capitol Hill and you advocate on Capitol Hill for whatever it is. The same thing can happen on the state level. Whenever there's an issue or a bill that has an issue that you are well aware of, whenever there's a hearing on it, provide that public testimony beforehand. You can talk to the office that's carrying the bill or anybody who's analyzing the bill. So just being aware of what issues are going on. Everything that happens in the legislature is public. It's open to the public, and it's open for public debate and input. And so making sure that your voice is heard, the voice of scientists are heard, and that actual evidence-based information is given. And the more that your name is known, if you end up coming out often, showing your face often, speaking up often, you'll get to that point where people would actually come to you as an expert and say, hey, I need information on whatever it is, mental health or something. That's my background. If I know that mental health expert who knows how to talk to us, who has that information, I would find myself reaching out to them and getting information from them. And so part of it is you yourself going out there and advocating on behalf of science, of whatever it is that you're an expert on. I might have to think for a moment about a particular story of somebody that's helped or not helped in that way. Like I've had a lot of people in different regards, or I actually do have one. There was in the first office that I was in it was called the Senate Office of Research, and we were doing a report or trying to gather a bit of information on a particular medication for opioid use or opioid abuse. And that was why I was pulled into it. It wasn't originally my project, but because I had the drug addiction research background, academic background, but they brought me into that project. So we were trying to get information on this drug, how it's prescribed, how it works into the whole Medicare system that we have here. And we were finding a roadblock. There is only some certain amount of information that we could get on our own. And so we actually brought in experts who do prescribe. So these were medical doctors in this particular situation. We brought them in, and they broke everything down to us. They explained, and they were very well aware of the policy side of things too, but they explained the medical, the prescribing side of it. And so having that conversation, they asked us questions on the policy end, and we just had a very good back and forth where technical information was broken down into a level where everybody can understand it. And we were able to move forward with that report with a full understanding of how everything worked together.
How did you find those experts, and especially ones who understood the policy implications?
That was actually a matter of reaching out to someone who reached out to someone who reached out to someone. So it was kind of a 3 levels down, reaching out first to the Department of, I think it was the Department of Public Health or Healthcare Services that we reached out, and they found somebody who then found somebody who was an expert in the field.
Mm-hmm. Through your network?
Yes, through the network.
Yeah.
What about you, Chris?
What about you, Chris? How do you engage experts in different areas and academics, scientists?
So we have all of our committee meetings in the interim. We have a legislative session, which is actually only 60 days every 2 years, when we end up passing the laws that we choose, and it's a pretty heavy duty 60 days. But the rest of the year we have our committee meetings, and the committee meetings are where we prepare the legislation, work the issues, try to explore and learn more. And those are all public meetings where we invite experts. We try to identify whomever is the most appropriate expert. Sometimes we hire consultants. Sometimes we have state experts that are willing to spend some of their time at the public meeting helping us out. Sometimes we end up with national experts depending on what the topics and policies are. I chaired a task force called the Digital Information Privacy Task Force for 3 years because Wyoming had incredibly antiquated laws on really digital privacy and all things related to IT. So the purpose of this task force was really to revamp those, and most of what we did was look around the rest of the country and try and pick the best statutes out there, figure out which states had done it right and cribbed a lot of their answers and put that forward. But that was an instance where we ended up having a large number of technical experts coming in from California, Washington, D.C., New York, Texas, and elsewhere who had already been experienced with this and really had some expertise that they could bring to the table. Both technical expertise as far as what can be done, as well as policy expertise of kind of the what should be done and how it should be regulated. So that was an area where I think we brought some exceptional experts in. I've also worked a lot on education policy, and you can really screw up education policy because there's so much anecdotal evidence that really it's rubbish, but it's somebody told me, someone said one time that their kid was taught in this way and that was bad for them, and I think that's horrible and we should change the education system. That's how a lot of education policy seems to be made. So that's an area where the committees that I've been on, both the education select committees and the committee itself, we've brought in experts, Ph.D.s from the East Coast that understand the literature, the actual science behind educating, what has been proven to be successful, what hasn't, how test scores should and shouldn't be used, how accountability systems should and shouldn't be developed. And over a series of several years working with consulting experts, we put together a system that actually makes a lot of sense, and we think it not only has worked, but will continue to work in the future. And that was against a lot of resistance of just the knee-jerk reactionary legislators that didn't want to hear the experts. They kind of know what's best, and it's a clear case where experts and literature won out over reactionary and emotional policy making, and it's made a tremendous difference in the nature of our education system moving forward in the state of Wyoming, and that continues now, where we have consulting experts that we look to, and we don't always follow their advice, honestly, but we certainly listen to it, weigh it, and then make the decision that's right for the state. As far as the other side, though, kind of doing it badly, I remember one education committee meeting where one of our school districts hired an economist, an expert, to come in and provide some analysis back to the committee about how the model we were using was not effective for their district, which honestly was true. I agreed with his conclusion. But this is an example of how not to do it. He was so academic and so arrogant and so patronizing to the committee that I knew we were going to vote against him no matter what he said. I mean, it was just an absolute certain no, whether he was right or wrong, and we did. So they.
The lesson is check your ego at the door, huh?
Yeah, because at the end of the day, even if you're right, you're still dealing with humans. You're still dealing with policymakers that are driven largely by emotion. And if they're offended, if they feel like the scientist coming in, the expert coming in, is acting as if they just know more and they're being instructive, they're enlightening the policymakers. It's not going to go well, and so that's a disservice really to the scientific and data-driven process, how it's presented. And it probably shouldn't be. Again, as I noted, the guy was right.
So it's not just the message, it's the messenger.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm sitting here thinking, and I'm sure a lot of people online are thinking, okay, except that I am not the world's expert in education policy and research or whatever, opioids or whatever, but I have, I know statistics, I can do data analysis, I'm a thoughtful, evidence, I can make a hypothesis and everything. So how do you think people like that who, aren't the world's expert but do have a set of analytical, they've got an analytical lens to shine on problems, how can they help?
Go ahead, Deborah.
I'd still say it's still the advocacy, it's still the reaching out, being aware of when bills are coming up, or just sitting down and talking to people who in the legislature who work on or who have carried certain types of bills that you're interested in, and just literally sitting down and having a conversation with them. Anybody can do that. If there's a bill that has a hearing, it has a public hearing, you can go and have a testimony and talk to, say your piece about whatever it is that you are, even that little bit of an expert, even if you're not the world-renowned expert, whatever you know about it, you can talk about it. And if there's something, especially if there's something near and dear to your heart and you have the evidence for it and everything, where you see an issue that needs legislation, maybe the legislation's not out there, but you believe that there should be, you can call up your elected officials, try and get a meeting with them or their staffer and talk to them about whatever that issue is, and try and have that conversation about what are different ways to rectify that issue.
What are your thoughts?
Wyoming's a little different from California in a few ways, and one of them really is access to individual legislators. We're a small enough state where, honestly, if one of my constituents needs to make a point and provide some data-driven argument, we're going to have coffee is probably how that's going to take place. So that's handy. You can't do that when you scale that up like you have in California, but you can still do that in Wyoming. So getting those points across really does depend on the environment you're in and where you want to make the point. As Deborah points out, you're almost always going to have some type of public testimony, some type of public hearing where you can get your information heard or seen. But that's not always enough. Really, a conversation with influential policymakers, with somebody who is involved in the process to present key data, key arguments. If it is within your area of expertise, I think that's a critical objective to just make sure that somebody involved understands the data behind it instead of just working off of the passions, the emotions, or whatever else may be the case. But as far as scientists and engineers getting involved, one of the struggles I think we have, and one of the reasons why there aren't more involved, is because of exactly what you said, Melanie, which is, well, I don't know about education policy. Scientists and engineers think of themselves as experts at something. I mean, I'm an expert technically at how water and methanol behaves on a platinum crystalline surface under ultra-high fields. And if I limited my policy influence and policy engagement to those instances, then I probably wouldn't have spoken yet. So I think part of the training you get when you become a Ph.D. in science or engineering, you start to learn actually how little you know. And it's a humbling experience. I never more fully understood how little I knew than when I had finished my Ph.D. and spent that much time working on such a tiny, tiny, tiny little thing. And there's so much more out there. A lot of the rest of the policymakers, you know, they're not cursed with that lack of, or cursed with that understanding of what they don't understand, I guess is what it comes down to. So it becomes a confidence-related issue where the scientists and the engineers don't feel like they know enough to engage, where those who honestly don't know a heck of a lot more feel more confident to engage. So I strongly encourage scientists and engineers to get as engaged as they can. It's the skill set of how they address problems and how they address the need to learn that is those are the tools in their toolbox that will make them very good legislators, or very good legislative assistants, or very good researchers within the policy realm, because again, they've learned how to learn in a way that others haven't, and that's a necessary skill when you're in policy. And honestly, one of the failings I think of our political system right now is that we don't have enough of those people. We don't have enough people who really can understand these difficult problems. So being the actual policymaker might not be for everyone, but I think scientists and engineers in state policy should be much more heavily engaged, because the state is really the engine of creation for the policy, and that's where the creative ideas are coming out of that are being used nationally. If we can bring our best and brightest into those discussions and help to shape that, it's going to influence all levels of government, and I'm disappointed there aren't more. I really would like to see more former fellows, more graduates with PhDs in science and engineering just getting heavily engaged, running for office. And I guess the words of advice I'd have is you'll do just fine. It'll work out.
I hear a call to arms.
Yeah, absolutely.
Everybody online, your call to arms. Deborah has dropped off of my screen.
I don't know if you can hear me. I know my screen is frozen. Yeah, so I'm still on audio. My screen is frozen. I'm trying to figure out what's going on there.
Okay, good. So we can still hear you. Okay, great. Good. Actually, I want to take a facilitator's prerogative. I'll share a story as well about getting involved as not the world's expert in state policy. When I was a grad student, early on, I found out about, I was studying stem cells, and that was at a time when stem cell policy was, you know, on the front page of the news. And one day I went down to Olympia because they were having a hearing on a stem cell bill, and I just wanted to learn. I was expecting to sit in the audience and listen. And then I found out two things. One is that there were no scientists testifying. There was one medical doctor testifying against stem cell research. And I found out also that you can just sign up to testify on the spot. So I did it, which is something I don't know that I would have the courage to do now, but as a grad student, I just got up there and I said, I study stem cells. This is what this bill would, what impact it would have on my work in our lab. And after that, everybody came up to me at the end and said, this is amazing. Would you help us understand more about stem cells? And so our student science policy group we organized two things. One was a big public forum on the science, ethics, and policy of stem cells. It's like 700 people came to. And the other was a closed door. Yeah, we had no idea. It was an election issue, so it was good timing. And we had a closed door stakeholders meeting where we invited not just the legislators from both sides of the aisle, and we worked with the staff of the legislature to get people there. We invited the scientists, we invited people who study legal issues surrounding beginning of life, we invited the person from the fertility clinic that has to collect the embryos, all those people, and our U.S. representative. And the question was, what should Washington State do about stem cell research, if anything? And the answer was, oh, maybe we shouldn't be worrying about this on a state level. It's really a federal issue. But that's the first time the scientists met the policymakers, ever. And they are still in touch. And the state is now putting money into stem cell research in our state. So those relationships that we started as graduate students were really valuable. I think we catalyzed something. And I just want to say to other students and others in universities, don't overlook your power of convening in a university and your access. Even if you aren't the expert, you have access to people with expertise in a lot of areas. So that was my story of my first state policy engagement.
No, that's absolutely great, Melanie. And, you know, public testimony makes a big difference in the committee meetings that I'm in almost every time. Yeah, you're listening for that feedback because typically you are expecting to hear from experts or people who will be directly affected by the policy. And if you don't hear that, then you're right. You're leaving it up to people who really are just basing it off of probably what they saw on television.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So we are at, we've got like 12 minutes, 13 minutes left before the hour. I just want to ask each of you in a couple minutes to give any tips that you have for people who are inspired to get involved but aren't quite sure how to get started. And then any of you who have questions, go ahead and type them in. There should be on the right side of your screen a question box. If you have any questions, go ahead and type them in, and we'll take a couple of those after Chris and Deborah's closing comments on how to get started in state policy. And Deborah, are you still there?
I'm still here. I'm almost back on video. I had to restart.
Oh, there you are. Yay,
Sure.
welcome back. Do you want to go first and suggest how people might get started?
Yes. I'm going to go repeat myself again and say advocate, advocate, advocate. Whether it's, as Chris said, in a smaller state, you might be able to sit down and have coffee with your elected officials. In a larger state, something like California, if you're in or near Sacramento, you can come to the Capitol and, you know, talk to the staffers for the elected officials. If you're further out, every single senator and assembly member has district offices, and you can go to the district offices, find out when they have town halls in your city and go to a town hall, go to whatever event they have, show up, speak, talk, make sure your voice is heard. That's one way. Another way is fellowships like this, like CCST or AAAS. If you're not quite finished with your grad school or your schooling or whatever level you are, there are other internships or shorter term ways that you can directly be involved in the process, whether it's, you know, just for a couple of weeks or instead of, you know, committing full time for it. But just finding out what are those opportunities that are available. But I think the most important thing is to call up your local elected, their office, and somehow have a way to have a sit down and talk with, if not the elected, at least their staffer.
So there are a lot of ways to get involved. And actually, I would say I've had coffee. I cold emailed my state senator, and the next week we were having coffee. And I would say I live in a largish state, So I think state, especially in the state policy level, I think it's easier to get in-person meetings.
Yeah.
Chris, what are your suggestions for getting started in politics?
One of the things Deborah said, which I think is key, is showing up for state level politics. Showing up at the Capitol and watching the process is a great thing to do. You know, free entertainment. You can you can track in any state. You can track legislation that's important to you. Every state, to the best of my knowledge, has some system, some database in place which is going to allow you to see what's going on with bills that you might find important, and then finding time to go to the Capitol or to go to hearings, committee hearings if they're held around the state relevant to that legislation is a great way to sort of start the process and see how things are done. If your state's a state like mine, we do move our committee meetings around the state. Our committees are held so that we can have public accessibility, and I know that other states engage in that as well. So you show up to those meetings and you have the opportunity in a much less formal manner to interact with legislators, to really hear what the thoughts behind the policies are and what is being weighed. It's never as easy and clear-cut as it seems to be when it's in the newspaper. You know, when bills are being drafted and passed, most of what we do in Wyoming, probably 95+%, has nothing to do with the party. It's all about just trying to get things right and arguing about the details and trying to come up with a good policy approach, knowing that there will be probably unintended consequences and we don't have a complete picture, we don't have full data. So showing up and seeing that that's the way things are done, I think makes it a lot more accessible. Instead of just seeing the headlines in the newspaper where somebody seems like they know what they're talking about and there's two very polarized sides. That's just not really the way most of it is. So
by the time it's in the newspaper, there might not be as much of an opportunity to impact it.
Absolutely.
Right? Because people have been talking about it for a while. Yeah. So what I'm hearing from both of you is learn about the issues, do your homework, and actually I know I can watch those committee meetings online here in Washington.
Yep.
And in California.
Okay. So
some of ours yes, some of ours no.
And it is more fun to go in person, I will admit.
Yeah.
It's side meetings during the breaks. That's where you're going to learn a lot.
Yep. So show up, do your homework, and also there are some. I know we also have internships here. Have you had students or interns, Chris?
I do. Almost every session I have at least one. I cherry pick my students from the University of Wyoming.
Okay. Well, anybody from the University of Wyoming online, there you go.
And Melanie, one other quick thought on that is getting engaged in local politics is also a great start. Running for city council, running for school board, county commissioner, whatever you have for local politics, that is a great way to start getting involved and getting some experience rather than you know, just jumping to a statewide office or a state legislative office. So it's another thing to consider.
Thank you. Okay, we have 6 minutes left, and we do have a few questions. I'm going to pick, let's see. One is a question about how scientists can introduce themselves to legislators, and also if you know if there are any, I'll just read a few of them and then I'll allow each of you to pick one to answer. How's that? If there's any fact-checking on legislation that you know about, that's a good question. Hold on, technical difficulties. One is Chris, how you bridge your university work and your political work. Do you work with other organizations? Do you find national organizations to be helpful in evaluating some of the technical aspects of issues? And that is it so far that I can see. And I apologize to anybody online if I'm not seeing your question.
As far as introducing, again, Wyoming is a very informal place. So in Wyoming, you would just have the opportunity to walk up to me and say, "Hello, my name is Chris. I have some expertise in this policy area. I wanted to share some of my thoughts." Or honestly, what you said, Melanie, is a great approach that you did. Send an email to a state legislator's office, provide your background. If you're in their district in particular, that's something that's a big priority in Wyoming. If somebody from my district emails me, then I'm going to meet with them, I'm going to respond, I'm going to try and do something for that individual in particular. If somebody's outside of my district, just based on time management, I have a lot harder time. But if you want to meet with one of your legislators, then meet with yours first, and they may be able to put you in contact with someone else. That's probably true in even California, where the districts are huge, I would assume. As far as balancing my university and
Hold on one second, Chris.
Yeah.
Because we're running short on time, we only have 4 minutes left.
Okay.
So, Deborah, did you have one of the questions that you wanted to answer?
Yeah, I'll go with the fact-checking one and say that there is fact-checking. When I'm doing my analyses, a lot of people, whether it's people who are staffing the bill, working for an elected official, and who are working for them and carrying the bill along, they give me information, lobbyists give me information. There are a lot of people giving me different information. I try and do as much as I can my due diligence to figure out where those numbers or where that information is coming from, make sure it's accurate, because if I put out an analysis, my analyses have my name on it. And so I want to make sure that anything I put out I'm proud to have my name on there. And it's public record, so for all of, for progeny and everything, my name will be on there. So I want to make sure that I do as much fact checking as I can. That being said, one major difference between working in policy and versus working in academia, when I was working on my dissertation, I had years and years and years to get information, to do all the literature search. I had a lot of time to dive deep and do all of that information and do all that data gathering. On the policy end of things, I might have a day, I might have a week, so I have to do really quick fact checking, and I have to learn at what point I have to be confident with the information that I've gathered. If I'm not confident with it, then I probably just won't go forward with that particular set of information. But it's on a lot faster pace, and so there is fact checking, but it's not as deep as a level as you'd be able to do in an academic setting.
Do you think somebody could help you with that? Is that an opportunity for people out there?
That is an opportunity for people in the academic setting to send information along, yes.
And how do they know what you're working on? How do they know what facts you need to check?
Everything that we do, as a bill is moving along, everything is public. You can look on the California Senate or Assembly website and follow along exactly where along the process the bill is. And so whenever, at any point in time, it needs to be analyzed. So see who is literally holding the physical copy of the bill and talk to those people and give information to those people.
All right. Well, we are just about at the end of our time. Do either of you have a closing one-sentence send-off for our viewers? Two, maybe?
Run for office.
Run for office, Chris says. And Deborah?
And I say just get involved, whether it's running for office or whether it's working for the person who ran for office. Get involved and get your knowledge out there.
Sounds good. It sounds like show up and you'll make a difference is what I'm hearing from both of you. Darren and Julia, is there anything else that you would like to add before we sign off?
Just want to thank everyone for joining the call today. It will be available later on the ESEP YouTube channel, which you can access through the ESEP website or through the ESEP page on Trellis. Please let us know if you have any questions. There's a contact email on the website too. thank you all, and I hope you all have a lovely rest of your day, wherever you are. Melanie, is there anything? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for hosting us. Thank you, Chris and Deborah, for taking the time to share your experiences and your tips for the rest of us. And if anybody out there would like to continue the discussion online, go to www.trellisScience.com/ESEP, and we'll see you online. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Melanie.